Brian there on WNYC. Now we'll talk about the rollout of New York City's new Pied-à-Terre tax on second homes in the city valued at $5 million or more. You probably know that last month, Mayor Mamdani sent out a tweet addressed to anyone who owns a second home in New York City worth more than $5 million. It said, "You've got mail." New York City's Department of Finance sent letters to thousands of high-value homeowners informing them that their property would soon be subject to this so-called Pied-à-Terre tax, aimed, again, to be really clear, at people who own expensive homes here but do not live in the city full-time. But a lot of people who got mail say they shouldn't have gotten mail because they do, in fact, live in the city, and these are their primary residences. For some background, Governor Hochul signed what people are calling a Pied-à-Terre tax in the spring, and it was framed as an alternative to Mamdani's campaign promise to tax the rich and the richest corporations more broadly. The state projected that this tax would generate about $500 million, helping to close the city's whopping $6 billion budget deficit that Mamdani was saddled with when he took office. So after a few months ironing out the details, the Department of Finance recently released a list of properties that may qualify for the tax, and they sent around about 17,000 letters to homeowners they deemed eligible or responsible. Another complication, that information was technically already public, as real estate ownership records generally are, but some owners and critics of the mayor, especially from the right, are saying that by publicizing the list and making it easily accessible, the city was effectively doxing them. And as I mentioned, many who got the letter say they've been full-time residents for decades. The city says it will, of course, grant exemptions to anyone who can prove residency, but a lot of reporting that's come out in the past couple of weeks has shown that process of appealing to the city saying, "Wait, you made a mistake," can be pretty cumbersome and confusing. The original deadline to appeal was originally August 21st, but because of the apparent confusion, it's been moved back to September. Kathryn Brenzel is a senior Kathryn Brenzel is a senior political reporter for Crain's New York business, and she's with us now to parse through some of these weeds and to answer your questions if you're confused about the rollout, which some people are. Kathryn, thanks so much for joining us. Welcome to WNYC.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
And listeners, if you have questions, if you were hit with one of these letters, even though you do actually live in the city, you can call in. What has the appeals process been like? And how do you feel about the Pied-à-Terre tax more broadly? Do you have questions for our guest about how it works? You don't have to own anything worth $5 million to participate. But what do you think of the controversial list itself and the way it was highlighted? Anything? We're taking your calls and texts, 212-433. WNYC, 212-433-9692. You want to talk about the list first? It's a searchable database of over 900,000 homes and their ownership records. What kinds of properties made it onto that very big list?
Yeah, so there was a lot of confusion around this list when it was first posted. I think initially folks thought this list was a comprehensive list of all of the properties that are subject to the Pied-à-Terre tax, but in fact it is those properties potentially plus hundreds of thousands of more properties. Every year the city publishes its tax roll list, so addresses, the valuation of those properties, something that happens every year. As part of, and it's mandated by state law, as part of the Pied-à-Terre tax rollout, the state legislation did require the city to publish a list that gave some kind of sense of, what properties could be subject to the tax. And essentially, the city's interpretation of that was, basically townhouses, condos, co-ops, basically residential properties that are taxed in the city. So somewhere in that list are properties that eventually will be subject to the tax, but it is, it includes far more properties than that.
This blowback, like in the New York Post, where they say the mayor was, quote, effectively doxing thousands of wealthy New Yorkers. I'm curious whether your reporting indicates that this hyper-public aspect of the rollout was an unintended consequence, or maybe not entirely unintended. It's worth noting, perhaps, that the mayor got some flack a few months back for filming the announcement video of the tax in front of one particular home, the billionaire Ken Griffin's $238 million penthouse. So clearly he's not afraid to name some names. Is that partly the point?
I mean, I think, as you noted, these records were always public. As a longtime real estate reporter, I have spent a lot of time using the city's database to search names and addresses of folks to figure out who owns a property. I think that there obviously was some sensitivity around the fact that this was a list where you could find all of this information in one place. But I think it's also important to note that a lot of these properties are owned through LLCs, they are owned through trusts. So in a lot of cases, you do not have, the person's first and last name attached to the property. And this is also information that is made public every year. So I do think, I think if you're going to talk about the, privacy concerns around this list, I do think it's part of a broader conversation around, New York's transparency around property records in general. I think obviously as a reporter, transparency is very important to my reporting, but I do think, I spoke to someone earlier this week who pointed out that the city's lien sale list, which is a list of properties that have outstanding property tax debt, water debt. It's a list of properties that could be subject to the lien sale, which means that their debt is purchased by a trust, and they ultimately risk losing their property. Those properties are all made public as well, and advocates for years have pointed to the fact that list, it makes folks who are already in a kind of financially precarious position potentially more vulnerable to scammers, to deed theft. Obviously that data set, that pool of properties, we're talking about people who are in a very different financial situation than the folks we're talking about who are subject to the Pied-à-Terre tax. But it's all part of this bigger question of like how New York treats its property records and, what's easily accessible to the public. So I do think it is part of a broader conversation versus, specific to these folks who are subject to the tax, especially because this is something that is public, made public every year. It's not specific to the Mamdani administration.
Alice in Manhattan. Alice, you're on WNYC. Hello.
Hi, how are you? I have a question about what properties the tax actually applies to, because I've read conflicting things. On the one hand, I hear homes for non-residents with a market value in excess of $5 million. But also I read that co-ops and condos with a market value as calculated by the city with a value of $1 million or more are also subject to the tax if you don't live there. And I'm thinking specifically, I live in Manhattan, but I also own a condo that I rent.
That you rent out?
So if that condo, pardon me?
Yes,
I rent out.
Uh-huh.
Yes.
Those are great questions, Alice. Thank you for putting them on the table. And there's really two separate questions there. Let's take each of Alice's questions, Kathryn. What criteria are they using to determine whether a home is a qualified pied-à-terre?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, in the first 2 years of the tax, condos and co-ops are going to have a different threshold. So it is that 1 million figure that you mentioned, and the reason why it's different for the first 2 years is because the city's property tax system, condos and co-ops taxed, compared to multifamily rental properties. So the thinking behind setting that lower threshold for those properties was to better reflect the actual value of those properties. After that 2-year mark, the city, in the next few years has to come up with a way of valuing these properties based on their potential sale value. And at that 2-year mark, they'll go to the $5 million threshold. The $5 million threshold.
Wouldn't almost anybody's actual pied-à-terre be a co-op or a condo, because that's what people generally own? People in that very high income category, high wealth category, if they own a pied-à-terre in New York City at all as a second home, it's not likely to be a freestanding private house, but an apartment that would be a co-op or a condo.
I mean, certainly there's going to be more of those cases than the other properties are, the 1, 2, 3 family homes, the townhouses, the townhouses that have been combined into what are effectively known as mansions by New York City standards. But you are correct that there would be more in that condo and co-op property.
And to Alice's second question, it sounds like she lives in the city, she's saying, but she does own this second apartment that she uses as a landlord. She rents it out. Would that be taxed as a pied-à-terre?
So under the law, if you are renting your property out full time to a tenant who uses that property as their primary residence, that property is exempt from the tax. So that is one of the criteria that the city is asking folks to, submit information about your lease and your tenant information to show that it would be exempt.
But it sounds like you think some people in Alice's category are getting hit with those letters, and then they have to prove that rental status.
Yeah, I mean, my understanding is that the city sent out letters to basically any property that is owned by an LLC or under a trust where they just didn't have documentation to show that it's being used as a primary residence. So there are definitely folks who receive those letters that shouldn't be subject to the tax. And I know the city has also said that they've sent letters in cases where they either had outdated information or incomplete information, or they just didn't have the documentation to show it. So, yeah.
Tina in Harlem has a question. Tina, you're on WNYC. Hi.
Hi, good morning. Thanks for taking my call. My question's quite similar. Your previous caller mentioned the market rate value of a property, and I was wondering how the city does determine that. So you did touch on this subject, because the tax rolls and the assessed values are often and almost always remarkably different than the market rate value, the sale price of a property. So, it can be double. The market rate can be at least double what's on the tax rolls. So I just would like to learn a little more about how they're establishing the cost basis.
Yeah, a lot of people have that question. How do they come up with worth $1 million or worth $5 million? Is it the assessed valuation previously by the city, tax department? Is it the Zestimate on Zillow? What is it?
It's determined by the Department of Finance, and they do have a formula they're using. They are, as I mentioned in the case of condo and co-ops, they are using, comparable rental buildings, which causes a whole set of problems when you're talking about a building that includes majority rent stabilized apartments. But I mean, the way that properties are taxed in New York City is also part of a much bigger problem that the Mamdani administration has said that it wants to address as well. So I think, for now, like the way these properties are being assessed is the way that the city has been doing it.
And is the assessed valuation generally higher or lower than the market value, what you could actually get by selling it?
I believe it's typically lower, but I mean, I think it depends.
Which would sweep more properties into the tax bracket than the actual market value might suggest. Or am I getting that backwards?
I think that's backwards.
Oh, right, because it wouldn't be, of course, if it's valued lower than the market value, then not as many would hit the $1 million or the $5 million threshold. Right. Okay, one more. Holly in Rockland County, who I think thinks she's going to be hit with this tax, and maybe legitimately next year. Holly, do I have that right? You're on WNYC. Hi.
Yes. Thank you. Thanks for taking my call. Yes, I'm not hit this year, but I believe that with the increases every year, I almost definitely will be next year. And I wanted to know, like, how you, it's kind of repetitive of the other, but like my apartment is, charitably worth maybe 2.5 to 3 million. So why did you use 1 million? It just seems like so much lower than the 5 million that I thought this was aimed at. And then the second question is, would I be able to, if I am, told that I have to pay the tax, would I be able to present Zillow or realtor assessments or comparables to show that my apartment is, worth far lower than the $5 million rate?
Holly, thank you. And give Holly an answer, and then we're out of time, Kathryn.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, when it comes to the $1 million threshold, the state determined, and I wish I had more details on how they came to that number specifically, but basically they determined that $1 million figure was as close as they could get to, kind of equaling that $5 million threshold for townhouses, just given that based on the belief that the condos and co-ops are generally undervalued based on how the city currently assesses these kinds of properties. That threshold will change after 2 years. We'll go to the $5 million threshold. As for documentation that you can present to appeal your assessment, I would recommend going to the Department of Finance website. And there's specifically a surcharge website tied to the Pied-à-Terre tax that says the kind of documentation you could present to appeal this. So I would start there, just to figure out sort of your best line of defense there.
Kathryn Brenzel, senior political reporter for Crain's New York Business. We really appreciate all the analysis. Thank you, Kathryn.
Thanks very much.